So welcome to today's session. My name's Tamsin Russell. I'm here with my Museums Association hat on, and I lead on workforce at the Museums Association. And why am I here talking about inclusive volunteering? I'm talking about it because from our perspective as a sector support organisation, we are really conscious around the need to diversify the workforce, and the way we do that is by inclusive practice. We're also really clear that volunteering is part and parcel of the heritage ecosystem. That people volunteer for a variety of different reasons, whether it is to gain skills, whether it is to participate in public life, as it were, whether it's to give something back, whether it is, to deal with loneliness, isolation, you name it. There are so many reasons why people volunteer. And you know that. So we are really committed to supporting that volunteer process because it is part of the ecosystem. It's part of a successful heritage sector. So today we've got an hour together until exactly 4 o'clock, so 54 minutes. And what I'm going to do today is essentially give you a bit of an overview around inclusive volunteering. I'm not going to focus on any particular constituent parts of the process. So I'm not going to deep dive into inclusive recruitment practices. I'm not going to deep dive in terms of inclusive cultures and what that might mean in terms of hostility from others within an organisation if you're trying to diversify your volunteer workforce. I'm not going to talk about equality impact assessments because I can bore you at another date about that. And I'm not going to talk to you about equality monitoring. Again, those are all deep dive subjects that we can easily schedule in as part of our placeholders around equality, diversity and inclusion. So this very much is a bit of an overview. So I appreciate that some of you will be coming this from different perspectives, different sort of areas of experience, journey, maturity, however you want to define it. But that's really the benefit, I think, of the HVG coffee afternoons, is it's an opportunity for you to reflect in a ring-fenced space. Hopefully you'll be inspired or make connections about what actions you want to take. But equally, what we hope is that you will, as part of this, share your knowledge with others so that we're all learning from everybody's approach to volunteering. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. So hopefully you will be able to see and everyone see sort of an indigo set of slides here. Brilliant. Yeah. I love a thumbs up. That's fantastic.
Just make them full screen for us.
I know.
Tamsin.
Yeah, I'm just trying to do that for whatever reason. My computer is being a little bit petulant. There you go. So if you do have any other questions, specifically about inclusive volunteering, in my role at the Museums Association, really happy to field any of those questions as well. And you will get copies of these slides. So essentially, I'm going to take you through a series of facilitated exercises that are going to be punctuated with some input from me. So we're going to talk a little bit, first of all, about defining inclusion, and you're going to do that in a breakout room. We're then going to do something around reflecting on your own current context, and that's going to be some individual reflection, so you can work out what's important for you. Then what you should share, who or what is in place to support you. And again, I will then give you some input after that, and I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the concept of the legislation for those of you that are less familiar, and also the code of ethics for museums and collections-based organisations, because those are sort of two things that can really, really help you when you're looking to influence or advocate internally. And then I want you to think about identifying your next step, and I have made this singular as opposed to plural, because if at the end of today you can identify one thing you're going to do differently, that's one thing you are able to put into practice that you perhaps hadn't thought about or hadn't got round to or committed to before we started the session. And then right at the end it says questions and answers. Appreciate that not everyone may want to ask a question verbally or in the Zoom space. So again, what you can do is feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions. And again, if there's a question that is you want to ask anonymously, you can direct message myself, Tamsin Russell, or Rhiannon, and we can have a look at those questions without it being, oh, I don't know, Alex Walker said, you know, so we've got real flexibility about meeting your needs. And the reason I say that is what I know about working in EDI in the museum sector is that we often come up against barriers. We often come up against fixed thinking, often come up against prejudice. And I appreciate that we may want to share necessarily all of that with other people in this space. So hopefully we're all on the same page, and I am going to get properly started. So we're going to start with defining our terms. And so what the lovely Rhiannon is going to do is allocate you into small, about 4 people or so in a breakout room. What we'd like you to do in the 10 minutes that you have is first of all, introduce yourselves. So just say who you are, where you're working, and begin to have a conversation around what you understand the term inclusion to mean. Also begin to reflect on what inclusion looks like in your organisation and what your situation is. So these particular questions that are here are just really for prompts. I'm not expecting a really structured approach. If you like that, feel free to do it. If you want to use these just really as prompts for conversation, feel free to do so. And you've got absolutely 10 minutes to do that. And we will put the information into the breakout rooms as well shortly. So is everyone clear about what we're doing first of all? Getting to know each other and beginning to define our terms. Over to you guys, and I'll see you at 21 minutes past. I think everybody's back. Thank you. I often find creeping feedback or death by feedback not particularly helpful. I don't and haven't asked for a nominated note taker for you to feedback for your different groups, but I just wondered if anybody wanted to share a flavour of their conversation at all. There's no requirement to, but was there anything that people did discuss, or was a bit of an aha moment, or any other reflections? There's usually where there is like literally no noise, but I want to make sure that you have the opportunity, if you want to share some of that discussion. And
I don't mind going, because I think I was sort of nominated for our group, but
okay, fine, Steph.
We didn't come up with a defined definition, and we were talking about diversity and inclusion and how they're interlinked, and it's quite difficult to give a definition of inclusion without talking about diversity and how we're working on both, and that all of us were really key around wanting to diversify our volunteering groups at the moment. We were all predominantly like on the elderly side of things, maybe white British or younger students in terms of tapping into universities. So we were just kind of discussing what each of us are trying to do to help with that, and then inclusion in terms of volunteers feeling included in decision making or feeling part of the process.
Well, thank you.
One small point from our group was that picking up on what you said earlier, Tamsin, about volunteering being part of the sort of whole ecology of employment in the museum, is that the two are interlinked, and if the organization really needs to work on both sides, both the having a inclusive and diversified workforce, so that people who are volunteering feel that this is an organization that they can see themselves being part of.
I think that's a really good reflection. One of the things I would think is an interesting one is that, and you'll all challenge me, but factually, if we think about the hoops that employees have to go through, which tend to be around credentialism and having qualifications, there's probably a greater likelihood of having diverse volunteers that may come from a variety of occupational backgrounds or not, as the case may be, than through the heritage line. I know that's an in principle one, because it's a broader pool, because I might have been volunteering in I've worked in the NHS, where we know they've got a huge in terms of the diversity profile there is far more sort of positive in terms of being way more diverse than the heritage sector. So yeah, so it's an interesting one. Actually, you might find it easier to diversify your workforce once you've diversified your volunteering group. Gus, we'll be here forever. But yeah, just a reflection about those hoops that you have to go through for professional roles. And I don't like making that distinction, but you know what I mean in terms of paid roles. But yeah, so it's good. That whole idea of representation, whole idea of seeing myself reflected in the organisation, either as an employee or as a volunteer is important, and also people's responses to that. I know we've had quite a few examples where perhaps more traditional thinking takes place in organisations, which then means that the individuals that do join from different backgrounds or with different underlying health conditions, etc., perhaps are not as welcomed. So that representation, Alex, is a really good point. Anything else?
In our group, Tamsin, there was quite a lot of conversation. I'll just mention some of the key words rather than kind of report it back verbatim, but active came up quite a lot, that this is something that we actively have to strive to do. So that came through quite strongly. Inclusion as a verb, going beyond the basic offer, kind of doing more, going to different groups. But there was this point that was brought up as well about needing to make sure that when we're talking about focus on inclusion, we're also talking about helping our existing volunteers to be inclusive in the way that they embrace perhaps a greater diversity of people coming into the organisation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Vanessa and I did a presentation sort of more specifically around that cultural side and induction processes or refresher processes for existing volunteers. And I can pop that slide deck in, Rhiannon, so they've got that step-by-step approach as well, although we're not going to cover that in as much detail today. Wonderful. The reason I like starting with definitions is it just begins that conversation for a start. I think if you're in a situation where you're going to have to influence or get people on board, then to understand what you understand by that term is really important, and also how it's located in how your organisation understands that term. So to be able to build a collective understanding around inclusion or inclusive practice is good. And I absolutely hear you in terms of, you know, well, what other words do we use? Do we use diversity? Do we use equality? Do we use equity? Do we use inclusion? I use inclusion because it is more of an active word. It's a process, that verb, that doing word, you know, so that's the reason I sort of use that as an umbrella term for all the other ones that seem sometimes quite fixed. So if we're doing inclusive practice well, just by that token, we will be increasing diversity, increasing equity, increasing equality of opportunity. So that's the reason I use inclusion as an umbrella term. Let me just share my slides. Hopefully you can see an indigo slide. So I'm going to just go back one. So inclusion, the action or state of including or being included within a group or structure. And I think that was great when you said actively. So I think in my next slide, I've just highlighted that action. So this doesn't just happen. And it also just doesn't happen one time in the year. This is an ongoing, purposeful commitment to inclusive behaviours, practices, procedures, policies. And included within a group or structure. So it's all about doing something. So it is about that equal access of opportunity. And primarily when we're talking about inclusive practices, we will be looking at using those or targeting those on existing excluded or marginalised groups. Okay, so it's great to hear. I think it was from Steph that sort of reflected, you know, majority of our volunteers are white British, a lot of our volunteers are student. So to have that baseline knowledge of what your diversity profile is, however blunt, is better than not having a sense of it. But what's better is to have a really good, detailed, granular sense of individuals' differences. And the reason I say that is increasingly I end up at meetings where people say, oh, we're not very diverse in here, are we? And I now challenge, I was like, on what measure? You know, what are you talking about? Are you talking about visible diversity, which often sort of is reduced to, do I have a disability or am I a different ethnic origin? So having an understanding of who your existing baseline is great, because that enables you to identify those that are excluded or marginalised. So identifying then the right group for you to be targeting your activities on. And those different activities will often play out differently depending on the group. The other thing I want to highlight just here, while we are talking about targeted interventions around inclusion, is to absolutely appreciate the context in which you're in. So I work in Scotland. I'm based in Scotland. If you look at our census data, we're 98% white European. Okay, so we've got a 2%, if we're looking from a race perspective, 2% of the population would identify as being of colour. And therefore, if, having looked at my existing volunteer base, I've identified that I've got a huge majority of white British or white Scottish, you know, it's not a huge surprise if we're then looking at the local or national demographic. I also hear a lot from individuals that work in very rural locations, and as a function of being in a rural museum or space, there is also a very different or not different local community. What that might mean is you may need to be very thoughtful about what your priority groups are, and then building them over time, rather than thinking I'm going to get everybody in now. Okay, what is the most realistic in year one? What's the most realistic in year two or in year three in terms of developing relationships and also practice? So just coming back to Rob's point around making sure that you support your existing volunteers, and Alex's point about making sure you support your existing employees. If you're starting to look at diversifying and including people that have previously been excluded or marginalised, to do that with a group that is more likely to participate, because guess what, the volumes around where you're located mean it's a quicker win, then enables the organisation to catch up in terms of those processes. Our definition at the Museums Association is about that inclusion in the broader sense. I think Steph talked about that. So this isn't just about diversity of profile, but are they included in decision making? Are they valued? Are they respected? So it's all of those things. But for us to be able to do that effectively, we need a mix of people to begin with. So one of the things I would recommend is, if your organisation does indeed have a policy around equity, equality, inclusion, respect, dignity, because it could sit in any of those policies, and that's the hard part. Have a look at your policy list. They may not have been established with volunteers in mind, but they may well have been written to include volunteers as part of that policy. By looking at your organisational policies and looking at how they define inclusion, you're in a much stronger position then to be able to influence and make change in the volunteering space, because what you're doing is using language and understanding that already exists, it's already been committed to as part of your organisation's landscape around policies and strategies, etc. So your current context, I'm going to stop talking and I'm just going to give you a wee bit of time, just about 3 minutes or so, for you just to answer this question. So, you know, what is your organisation's focus? What are you trying to achieve? What's your inclusion goal in terms of your particular area of practice? So this is an individual exercise. Don't need to share it at all with anyone else. But I do want to give you that ring fence time for you to think about that. And so I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to get your ideas down on paper. And just as Rob said, it doesn't need to be a sentence. It can just be some words. But just to take stock and say, okay, from my perspective as a volunteer manager at the Museums Association, what would I like to see differently? Is everyone clear about that? So 3 minutes just to reflect on where you sit in your organisation. What are you trying to achieve? What would you like to see done differently? What's your goal? What's your organisation's focus around this? 3 minutes, go. Apologies for that noise. another minute. Share this, but I just do think there's a utility in just taking a sense of where you are and what it is you want to do, because that will have an impact on your next steps. So I just want to give you a little bit of an overview, again, depending on where you are with your journey, what you might well identify. You know all of this anyway, so this can just be seen as a bit of a refresher. But what I do want to highlight, that in all of our conversations around inclusion, in all of our influencing opportunities, we have legislation and ethics on the side. So whilst I would always hope that individuals, just as the nature of being a good human being, want to see everybody participating in public life, want to see diversity of volunteering, people don't always do that. So sometimes you might need to use other methods to affect change. And legislation is one of them. And let's just talk about that. So for those of you that are less familiar, this is the Equality Act 2010, one of the most fundamental pieces of legislation to come to pass, primarily as a function of the Labour government. But as it was introduced, that's when we saw that changeover, which then meant that how it's been implemented across the UK, so I'm based in Scotland, very much depended on the nature of the government, either at Westminster or at the Senate or at Holyrood. So it's not as strong as it was in its first intentions, but it still enables us to work not just around employment, but about our provision of public services as well. So there's something around eliminating unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Certainly once we have volunteers on board, all of that is covered by the legislation. Advancing the opportunity of people to participate in public life is essentially also one of the aims, as well as fostering good relationships between people and communities. And again, we often see that as being a very clear priority for organisations who want to work and establish relationships with their communities to do interesting work or not. And that can also then be part of that volunteering process. I mean, ultimately, the intentions here are around removing, wherever possible, anything that would be disadvantageous. So another thing that we're not covering today, but something that you might want to be thinking about or gathering information on is, what is it? What are the barriers within your organisation that's stopping you from attracting and retaining volunteers from different backgrounds and experiences? And thinking about how you will be more proactive in being able to meet the needs of those groups. And this whole idea, and I've already reflected on this encouragement of participation in public life, and specifically where we see it being disproportionately low. So what we might say is what we know, well, from some areas, certainly from the vision and volunteering and the recent research from NCVO around the state of the nations, really, in terms of volunteering, is that, you are more likely to volunteer if you are educated or if you're middle class. So again, how are you going to be looking to affect that where you've got disproportionately low? But you can only do that if you know, guess what your diversity profile is of your own volunteer workforce. The Equality Act 2010 dictates a number of responsibilities at an organisational level. For those of you that are working in a public sector organisation, these are mandatory requirements as part of your work. If you're not a public public sector organisation, there's still a responsibility to do this, but it's slightly less strong in terms of you're less likely to be held to account, depending on where you're located in the UK. But there is something around making sure that how you do your business as a policymaker, it's fair and equitable, how you employ, and that's specifically employment perspectives, but a lot of that can be sprinkled down in terms of volunteering. And then also as a service provider, so what you're delivering to meet the needs of your customers, for example. And as the legislation highlights, we've got 9 different areas that are protected. Those tend to be the focal points of most diversity and inclusion work. But what we also know is that there are other aspects that have an impact on the mix, that rich mix, and those aren't protected by law. For example, educational attainment, class, socioeconomic status. So again, when you're thinking about your inclusive volunteering, you have this as a very clear approach, a very clear line in the sand around legal priorities, but you do have some scope around other groups and mixes, not based on legislation, but often based on ethics, which we'll come to in a second. I want to introduce the concept of intersectionality. It's a word that gets used a lot. And essentially, for those of you that are less familiar with that terminology, it's about accepting that when you're looking at diversity, you can't look at it from a single lens. So there are always going to be other factors that affect an individual's experience. So my experience of the world is as a woman, but my experience of the world is as a white woman. My experience of the world is as a white, educated, able person. So all of those things, that concept of intersectionality is really important when you're beginning to build what your next steps are. And the research will say very clearly that if you belong to a number of different groups, you then experience multiple discrimination ultimately. So you're more likely to be more marginalized, more mistreated, more excluded. And therefore, as an organization, you may want to put additional efforts in around those different areas. I said I was going to mention ethics before I get you to go into little sort of work breakout rooms again, but the Code of Ethics for Museums, and that's the Museums Association document, applies to all collections-based organisations, and it talks about good ethical practice. And for me, it's really the cherry on top of the legislation. It takes the letter of the law and applies the spirit of the law. And again, there are some really fantastic bullet points within the Code of Ethics that you can use to influence and inform your practice. I'm just going to highlight this one, which is under individual and institutional integrity, which highlights really clearly 3.7, abide by fair, consistent, transparent workforce policy for all those working in the museum, including those in unpaid positions. So again, if you're not getting very much traction, or if what you're hearing is, oh, but they're not an employee, we don't have to do that. Do you know what? If you're a museum and you're working ethically, there is this requirement, this encouragement to work fairly, consistently and transparently. So what I've just done is highlighted 2 black and white-ish bits of infrastructure that could support your confidence, support your conversations and your game plan. So I'm now going to get Rhiannon to put you into small groups again. And this is going to be for just about 10 minutes. So we'll be coming out at about 5:02. And I want you to explore what and who is in place to support you. Okay, so over to you, Rhiannon. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, but put this in the information and we'll get started. Get quite excited when I see or everybody coming back in, which just demonstrates more about me than anything else. Wonderful, thank you so much. Now this is really your opportunity to play bingo, so I appreciate you've had conversations, and one of the things that I know is really important is exchanging where those resources and support areas lie in your own organizations, and all the conversations you've had, whether you're in a group of 2 or a group of 4 or a group of 5, ultimately you've been swapping ideas around power bases. So I'd already started talking about legislation and codes of ethics. They're really clear areas to support you. But whatever your organisation has internally, scour it for commitments to inclusion. Take out, star, bullet point, highlight all the phrases, all the previous successes that may well have been talked about in annual reviews if you've got them. Look at that gamut of policies and procedures that talk about inclusion and equity and diversity. And remember, it's not going to be as obvious as an equality opportunities policy. Those times have gone. It's probably some opaque, exciting title that means nothing to anybody. So you might need to do a little bit of research into that. Have a look to see if there are any resources or budget available. Do you have any funding agreements in place with any big funders that have prioritised inclusion? How can you piggyback on that? Is there any research that's been undertaken internally or externally that would highlight a particular need, gap, issue, challenge, red flag? Again, all of those things can either help you influence towards or influence to make change if they're more, oh my goodness, I better do this otherwise, if they're a compliance person. So have a look if there are any grievances. Are there other people that are around? So trade unions, and even if you don't necessarily have a local officer based or an EDI trade union officer based in your organisation, if you recognise a union in any way, shape or form, you will be able to get access to people that have that as their specialism. So you can then be able to comment and speak to them about that. You might find there are dedicated roles or teams or particular advocates about this area of work in your senior teams, or if you're a trustee-led organisation, in your trustees. Part of all of this is around thinking about how you can get other people to support you. And that could be the actual people, the stakeholders, the communities that could help you. But other than that, what you're looking to do, hopefully, is find other people to do so. So can you form a relationship with another organisation or association? Is there somebody else that could be an ally and a flag waver for you to get your message across? I often do a pronged approach. So I've just very quickly begun to talk about what you might have in place to support you. So things I would recommend as we close up is look at your organisational policies, look at your KPIs. Is your organisation being measured on their inclusive practice? If they are, that's great, because that means you can leverage that. And other actions, really, when you're thinking about the other people that are around that can help you, look to connect with groups, maybe other HVG members, use our Trello board, attend our EDI surgeries. All of those things will support your confidence in your next steps, which is my next slide, which is, what is your next step? And you don't need to pop it in the chat function this second, don't worry. But all I think we need to do, because it can be overwhelming and we always have too much to do and there's never enough time, is if we choose to take one step a month, that's 12 steps we wouldn't have taken if we hadn't chosen to take that first one. And the other thing I know, to carry on with a shoe analogy in the last 1 minute, is there is always somebody else in this network who has been in your shoes where you are now, and they know which steps work for them. So let them help you take your first steps. That's the end from me. Over to Rhiannon to close the session.